Hello, everyone, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depends on where you are in the world. It's always exciting to have these conferences online because we have people from all over the world joining us, and this is always exciting. So we have what I think is probably one of the most interesting topics today in today's conference, and it goes to something that I think whoever follows the delegitimization campaign against Israel have seen a lot that has been said about the military courts, the military proceedings, how it is being conducted, and of course what we hear usually is very one-sided. And we wanted to bring you here today and bring two experts to kind of share, what really goes on. We have Yonah Jeremy Bob, who's a journalist, a lawyer, I'll let Joe introduce him in a minute, but he's a true expert, and he's written an amazing book that we've also titled the webinar After Justice in the West Bank. He's interviewed key people that have been doing professional work in the military courts and surrounding the military courts. And with him, I think one of the most brilliant professionals in our field, Maurice, don't take it personally, but he's a friend, he's a colleague, he's a brilliant guy. He was a prosecutor in the military courts, and he can definitely help shed a lot of light into this topic. So I want to welcome everybody to this webinar. I want to thank Heideman, Kalik, and Nudelman for their help, Joseph Tipograph for hosting and moderating. I want to thank Israel Forever Foundation and everyone who took part in this important event. And I'm gonna let you take it from here, Joe. Go for it. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Yifa, for your remarks and for your excellent leadership at the International Legal Forum, our key sponsor for today's event. Welcome everybody to today's program. Before we begin, a few things to note. It is intended to serve as a public service to listeners, and our aim is to help people understand how justice is provided in the region. The views expressed by the speakers in this program are theirs alone. They do not reflect my views or the views of this program sponsors, the International Legal Forum, the Israel Forever Foundation, and the Washington, D.C. based law firm of Heideman, Nudelman, and Kalik. For those attorneys who desire to apply with your own bar associations for CLE credit, we will announce two codes for you. And at the end of the program, you will need to send us an email with the two codes and request the certificate of attendance, which we will send you. And along which we'll attach the handouts that we'll be showing throughout the program. So the first code is law. And lastly, before we begin, I'd like to recognize Ariana Heideman Tipograph of Starburst Communications, who is producing today's program. If her last name sounds familiar, yes, she's my wife. And if her middle name sounds familiar, yes, her father is a partner at Heideman, Nudelman, and Kalik, who I represent, where I practice law and am moderating on behalf today. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty. We are presenting for you all today a dialogue between Yonah Jeremy Bob, the Jerusalem Post reporter and legal analyst who covers, among other things, Israel's military court system in Judea and Samaria. And we also have Maurice Hirsch, a former IDF prosecutor in the system. Last year, Yonah published his first manuscript, Justice in the West Bank, which is a diverse, character-driven insider look at the court system, and it features Maurice as one of his main characters. I'm pleased of having had the privilege to work with Yonah on helping getting the book published. So let's get started. Yonah, I'm sure everyone here knows Yonah Bob, the Jerusalem Post reporter, and certainly read many of your articles. As your beat covers many of the legal issues surrounding Israel in the national and international arenas. But our participants may not know about Yonah Bob, the lawyer. So please tell us a little bit about your legal background and how it informs your coverage.
Sure, be happy to. Before that, I just want to thank Joe Tipograph, Richard Heideman, and Yifa Segal. All of you in multiple ways helped make this book possible. And Joe was really with me for a very long time already, for a couple of years at a lot of different stages. But so thank you to all of you. And I'm really glad to see Maurice here. Not only was he, one of the four main characters in the book, but I also continue to work with him in my Jerusalem Post capacity. I just wanted to say one or two other quick things. We did invite a couple of lawyers who represent Palestinians to present as part of this panel, and they declined. So you might not get the full picture of sort of both sides that the book presents, but then you can buy the book. And if you buy the book, you'll get to see that it actually has two characters sort of from the Israeli perspective and two characters representing the Palestinian perspective. In terms of myself, I was a lawyer. I'm still technically a lawyer, but I was a practicing lawyer for 8 years in the United States first, not related to any of this, doing corporate reorganizations law. But in Israel, I worked in the Justice Ministry International Law Division, and in a couple of different units in the IDF, each of them having something to do with international law. The last one was the military prosecution in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, however you want to refer to it. And I think one thing that I'll say is, first of all, now that I'm a journalist, it gave me an entirely new, different perspective, because when you're a journalist, you come in a different gate, and you're only allowed in for certain aspects of the proceedings. There's a lot of sort of top secret stuff when you have a security case, a terror case, that journalists aren't allowed in for. And I was allowed in for that when I was practicing as a lawyer. And when you come as a journalist, you come for like major events. The leader of Hamas is on trial. Some major terrorist who killed a large number of people is on trial. You come maybe once every couple months for something like that. And I was able to walk in every day, sometimes for multiple hearings, and really get the pulse. And it is a wild west. It is, we'll talk about how in terms of law, that the laws of evidence and the laws of procedure are almost identical in most areas to Israeli law. And there's always a trend to make it closer and closer to Israeli law. We'll get into that a little bit later. But in terms of that, you have these, two peoples, Israelis and Palestinians, who speak different languages. So every question that's asked, you have a translation, and you have two different cultures. And sometimes you'll have, these unbelievable scenes where a terrorist and his family are in the same room, a couple of feet away from the family of victims who were killed by that terrorist. And just having that mix in a room is just it's not, as somebody who's been in American courts and in Israeli civilian courts, it's not something you see in most places. And I can't say I completely knew what I was getting into when I went there. I was actually told from I was working at the time in the International Law Division, and I was told by my commander it would be a good place to work on my Hebrew writing, because you file a lot of indictments and legal documents. But I didn't realize the full range of what went on there. Certainly when I was working there, the largest number of cases was actually your average Palestinian just crossing the border illegally. And usually they weren't prosecuted all that severely. They weren't. Some of them didn't do any jail time. Some of them did a small amount of jail time. Since then, I'm told that more and more of the cases have to do with terrorism, but there really is a wide variety of what those courts deal with. And so, now that I'm a journalist, when I hear things and see things, I have a different level of dimension, and I tried to put that in the book to sort of bring people actually into the courtroom, sort of, not just the way you might hear about it in sort of a normal person in the media who might be covering the courts for a while, but doesn't have that insider outlook.
Thank you, Yonah. Maurice, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Okay, thanks, Joe. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, depending on your time zone, whatever the right salutation may be. So a bit about myself. I was born in South Africa, moved to England, finished my law degree there, did my thesis, wrote my thesis on international criminal law, prosecution of war criminals. I then moved to Israel, finished my year of articles and went to the bar exam. Having immediately passed the bar exam, I then immediately went into the IDF, and then I spent 20 years in the IDF. I did a number of different jobs in the IDF, but most of the time I spent in the area of Judea and Samaria, of law enforcement in Judea and Samaria, and specifically terrorism. I started in 1998 when obviously we were building peace. It was the height of the Oslo Accords. And one of my first missions was to try and understand with the Palestinians how we would implement the idea of a safe passage from Gaza to the West Bank, Gaza to Judea and Samaria, however you'd like to call it. And immediately the reality was quite clear. The Palestinians could not understand, that idea never came to fruition, because the Palestinians could not understand why they couldn't get on a bus in Gaza City with a bomb and get off on the other side in Judea and Samaria with that same bomb, or maybe on the way stop at a gas station and get off there. That was not something which the Palestinians could understand. I then spent a few years dealing with terrorism from 2000 to 2003 in the office of the legal advisor for Judea and Samaria, really the cutting edge of fighting the major Palestinian terrorism. I then moved to the prosecution, where I had until then been just a part-time prosecutor as the head of the prosecution, or the appeals prosecution, and then later to be the deputy head of the prosecution. I spent then 6 years doing other things, legal advice to the Air Force, Navy, ground forces, everything that fights but isn't a geographical command. And then I went back to my last position before I retired from the IDF as the head of the prosecution for Judea and Samaria. Since I've now retired, I also, like Yonah, get to see another side of the courts. I now represent victims of terrorism and help them understand the criminal process that's being undertaken. As Yonah said before, that crazy situation where you're the family of the victim of a terrorist and you're going into the courts to see the prosecution of the terrorist that killed possibly your loved one. That's an unbelievable situation to be in. I try to recommend to my clients, never, I say clients, understand please, it's all volunteer work. I take no money for it. It's not something which I have a proper day job as well, but that's just my volunteer work. I explain to my clients that this isn't a scene that they want to see. What do you have in the courtroom while the process is going on? On the one hand, you have the judges and the professionals, the lawyers and the prosecution discussing the different parts of the process, whether it be evidence, whether it be remand, whether it be specific cases of law which are relevant for the more general trial. And in the background, you have the terrorist himself and his family. What you see in these instances are happy families. You don't see remorse. You don't see any type of regret. You see the terrorist, the murderer, waving to his family, "Hi guys, how are you?" And on the other side of the courtroom, literally meters away, feet away, are the victims who are watching the scene and thinking, what on earth is going on here? This isn't justice. How is this allowed to happen in a courtroom? And you try and explain to them what the process is, how criminal trials are conducted, that this is really just part of the run-of-the-mill criminal process. This is something which they'll have to see over and over and over again if they choose to go down that path of coming to the trials. If they, on the other hand, choose to just appoint me to represent them to go to the trials and then report back, then obviously the story is much better. My time in the prosecution was amazing, I have to say. I got to do, as I explained before, I'm not a naturally born Israeli. Having made Aliyah as a foreigner, as an immigrant, as an Oleh to Israel, to be in the IDF was amazing. To reach the rank of lieutenant colonel was even more amazing for me. And to be the head of the prosecution, where really you take everything that the fighting forces have done, soldiers going to the houses of terrorists at 3 o'clock in the morning, pulling them out of beds, facing the hostile environments into which they enter. And really, you're now standing at the pinnacle of all of that effort, saying this is a terrorist and he should go to jail for as long as possible. That was, for me, an incredible experience. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, dealing with the criticism of the system, which was not a small amount of criticism. 6 days after I entered my position, landed on my table a report from the UN Children's Organization, from UNICEF, that basically accused myself of committing crimes against humanity, nothing less than that, war crimes, because we arrested Palestinian miners like Morada Dais. I'll tell you in a minute who Morada Dais is, because we arrested and then prosecuted Morada Dais. Who is Morada Dais? Have you ever heard that name? You can shake your heads or whatever, and I'll answer you. Anyway, Morada Dais was a 15-year-old Palestinian kid who, as a result, he explained, this is what he explained, as a result of incitement on Palestinian television, he took a knife, broke into the nearby settlement, and stabbed Daphne Meir, really one of those angels that walk among us, a nurse, someone who had adopted and fostered children, and just an amazing person, stabbed her repeatedly in front of her children. The last thrust of the knife, please excuse the graphics, but you have to understand really the level of evil that you're dealing with. The last thrust of the knife was so deep into her skull that he couldn't take the knife out. Now imagine being accused of committing crimes against humanity, Auschwitz, and the prosecution of Morada Dais for murdering Daphne Meir. That's the comparison. That is the criticism that I had to deal with. I then initiated talks with UNICEF after persuading the foreign ministry and the army, and only to get through that whole entire process to realize that exactly what we knew from before. The UNICEF included in the UN bodies have nothing to do with truth. They are not interested in truth. They're just interested in slandering Israel. That's the realities that you need to deal with in the court. The more technical stuff we'll get to within the course of the panel. And so maybe I'll leave it there for a minute and go back to you, Joseph, or to you, Yonah, whoever's going to take it on.
Thank you, Maurice. That was quite an image you painted for us. Yonah, why don't you just share with us some of the main points you want to get across, both in publishing your work and today in our talk?
Sure. First, I want to talk about the three purposes why I wrote this book. One was debunking falsehoods and lies about Israel by people who support the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign and other critics of Israel. I can tell you that when I was in university and law school, at some point I was looking to do some research, write a paper on the courts, and the only book that was available on the subject was extremely one-sided. And so, I wanted there to be a book that was balanced, that people who are facing a lot of all sorts of attacks on Israel and university, and they're like, I know that there's probably more to it, but I don't know what the more to it is. So I wanted, to provide that. That was definitely a main purpose. Another main purpose is help Israel improve. I think I'm going to talk about this a minute in sort of another dimension. I think Israel really does try hard and gets a lot of things right, but nobody's perfect. The United States isn't perfect, England isn't perfect, France isn't perfect, and Israel isn't perfect. And there's always places we can improve. And I'm not sort of really putting forth my views, but by interviewing Maurice, who was the chief prosecutor, I also interviewed the chief justice of the courts. And by interviewing two leading lawyers for Palestinians, I was able to sort of put before the reader a lot of ideas from both the sides about how things could improve. And dialogue. Maurice just talked about one experiment with dialogue, which aspects of it, I would argue, were successful, and aspects of it were very disappointing, as Maurice highlighted, in terms of working with UNICEF. But I think in this age where everything has sort of become tribalized and polarized, and nobody wants to talk to somebody who they disagree with, putting two people from this side and two people from the other side in one book to talk about this very complicated topic, I thought could help dialogue between the sides. So that's why I went about the book. In terms of what I think we can take from the courts, sort of some very big important themes. First of all, as Maurice just highlighted, the reason the courts exist is to combat terrorism. All right, there's the IDF soldiers who are fighting terrorists in combat, but what happens when you arrest somebody, what happens when you catch somebody while they're committing a crime, after they're committing a crime, what do you do with them? So there needs to be something to do with them. And I just want to strike home the whole, how powerful the terrorism is. And for those of you, at least from the United States, this is a passage I'm going to read from Ezra Schwartz's mom, Ruth. Ezra was from Massachusetts. He was in Israel in 2015, and he was gunned down just because he was a Jew. And he's not the last one. There was a lot of people may know Ari Fold, who was a former New Yorker who was killed in 2018. And it's sort of an unending list. I'm just going to read a small passage that I think makes very powerful sort of what the terrorism does. When Ezra's mother, Ruth, first got notice that something bad had happened with Ezra, she was doing a physical therapy home visit. I was at a visit when my husband called. I didn't answer because I was busy. He texted, "It's an emergency." I called back. I had two little 20-month-old babies sitting in front of me with their brand new au pair. My husband told me Ezra was attacked. I didn't understand what he meant. He was yelling and crying. He repeated that Ezra was shot and it was bad. I frantically but calmly excused myself. My mind was racing. I was nervous and scared, but hoping he would be okay. I got to the car. I called my sister in Israel and told her to go find Ezra. She said she felt scared, helpless, disbelief. She couldn't imagine life without Ezra. So this was, again, it's just one. There's a few Americans who have been killed while they've been in Israel, but this is something that Israelis live with year round, and that's why the courts exist. And it's important not to forget that. Now, there's a whole nother dimension. This gets reported in the global media a lot, relating to Palestinian minors, usually has to do with rock throwing and how they're treated by Israeli law enforcement after rock throwing. There's also certain, usually actually harder core terrorists go on hunger strikes when they're put in what's called administrative detention. We can talk about that maybe what administrative detention is more in question and answer session if people want. And so these two things get coverage in the United States, CNN, BBC, China, Russia, all over the planet. And part of what I wanted to ask is, is it possible for Israel when it's dealing with these complex issues to remain a democracy, at the same time guarding its people's national security? Now that we've talked about the terrorism Israel, the terror threats that Israel faces are far more than any other democracy in the world faces. And my answer is yes. To sort of get more into that, eventually you have to get into the book, but that can't be the end. And that's why I come to the third point, which has to do with the reforms. One thing I talk about in the book is Arabic, and the fact that there is translation of Arabic in the courts. There's been a bigger push for more translations of more kinds of documents, even since 2009 and even since 2013. But you have translators of Arabic in the courts, but the judges mostly don't speak Arabic. The prosecutors mostly don't speak Arabic. And I talked to some of the officials. How about trying to train more judges and prosecutors to speak Arabic? And they all said that's a great idea. It's just not realistic. We won't be able to find enough people who have the legal training to do this kind of work and who also will be fluent Arabic speakers. So it's whether it's possible or not, I don't know. But it's an area. There's no violation of international law about this. It's just an area where sometimes perception of whether justice is done is as important as the justice being done itself. So that's one thing. And in terms of administrative detention, again, I'm going to talk more about what it is later on. But it's a different kind of proceeding. It doesn't follow sort of the normal criminal procedure. Judges are involved in the picture, but there's debates within the IDF. The current Chief Justice, Netanel Benishu, as well as former Deputy Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, Eliakim Rubinstein, a number of other officials, would like to make some reforms to administrative detention. And they have some disagreements about that with some other legal officials and also with the Shin Bet, that's Israel's Homeland Security Agency. And so this is an important debate to talk about and for people to see. Israel takes this issue seriously. It's not that everybody in Israel has one viewpoint. And when you can see there are multiple viewpoints, it's sort of harder to say, oh, Israel is all, the situation is all black or all white. There's a lot of gray. There was actually an earlier point where I was going to call the book The Gray Zone, after a comment made to me by a different former prosecutor. But anyway, we picked the title we picked in the end. The publishers have a lot of influence over the titles, what people will understand the most. So I think those are, some of the biggest issues that come to mind. And Joe, I don't know if you wanted me to talk at all about sort of some specific historical issues or sort of some of the more specific legal issues that get addressed in the courts as well, where you wanted to go next.
I do want to go there next, but I do also want to just give Maurice an opportunity to weigh in on what you just shared and give his perspective as well.
Thanks, Joe. I have to say, in part as a bit of a balance to what Yonah is explaining, we must understand we are not necessarily on, as it were, on the same side, that we have our own differences of opinion. Whilst every legal system needs to constantly consider reform, it must be stressed that the legal system in Judea and Samaria at the moment in the military courts is of a substantially high level that is guaranteed also by the Israeli legal system. Yonah mentioned some of these things almost in passing before, but then gave some descriptions which really didn't fit in with that reality. For example, the rules of evidence, courtrooms being open for the public to come and see and to watch. Yonah's right. There are some hearings in which either specific witnesses whose identities need to be protected give evidence in closed session, but 99.99% of the hearings for the criminal process are held in open session. The rules of evidence, one of the first and probably the smartest decisions made by Israel already in 1967 was to write in the law in Judea and Samaria that the rules of evidence that would be applied in the military courts are the same rules of evidence applied in the Israeli civilian courts. No changes, no differences, no backdoors, no secret evidence before the judge. Again, I'm talking about the criminal trials, not administrative detention. A serious criminal trial that's held at a serious evidential level, procedure adopted from Israel. So when you hear the criticism, and the criticism is attacking the laws of evidence in the courts in Judea and Samaria, what really the criticism is saying is that Israel's civilian legal system, Israel's civilian criminal system is lacking in its provisions and its defense of defendants or suspects, whatever they may be. But you have to understand what that criticism is. It's not a criticism of the military courts, because that's how it's often phrased. It's criticism of Israel's system, which is why it's so easy in most of the cases to really just negate or almost out of hand. That's one point. The second point is you also have to understand what the courts do and what purpose they serve. It was mentioned that they serve the purpose of fighting terrorism. 2 minutes history. Until the Oslo Accords, the courts dealt with a whole spectrum and really possibly the full spectrum of different criminal activity, from drug abuse to children going mad in the local park to drunkenness, anything up to and including obviously terrorism. As a result of the Oslo Accords, the jurisdiction of the court was very much, I would say, clipped. And now the courts only have the power to deal with cases of terrorism and with specific cases of plain criminal activity carried out by Palestinians in Area C or in the Israeli settlements, or maybe leaking over into Israel. That means that the whole nature of the court is very specific. I'll give you an example. Some of the criticism says that in the regular system, the percentage of defendants who are held on remand pending trial is only 15 to 17, 18%. In the military courts, the number of defendants held on remand pending trial is 70%. That's obviously discriminatory against the Arabs in the military court system. Although that's simply not true, because in the civilian courts, again, you're dealing with the whole spectrum of offenses. The lighter offenses obviously are the bulk of the cases in the courts, and therefore the defendants are not held on remand pending trial. The severe cases, the cases of violence, the case of terrorism, they're the 15 to 17% of cases where the defendants are held on remand pending trial. Understanding that is critical to understanding the functioning of the court. Just knowing what they deal with and what they really don't deal with is tremendous. That's something which has to be understood. The third point that I want to make is also understanding the system as an Israeli system and not as an American system. I apologize for that generalization. I'll explain why I said. I've given a lot of lectures over time, and the criticism that I generally get is that, well, to an American audience, you have to explain why the procedure, why the laws of evidence in the military courts is different from the American experience. I don't say this lightly, and definitely I don't wish to be rude, but for the American audience, you have to understand the world doesn't work by American law. Other countries have different laws. Israel's law is predominantly based historically on British law more than American law. That means rules of evidence. That means things which you would see in America, Miranda requirements, simply don't exist in Israel. It's sufficient in Israel. The example I always gave is, well, if my child was to be arrested for a crime, would I be allowed to be present in his interrogation? The answer would be no, even though I'm a lawyer, I'm the head of a prosecution, I'm a lieutenant colonel in the army. Israel doesn't allow lawyers in the interrogation room. That's just it. And that has to be understood. I really could go on and on and on with those different things, but I think we should possibly go back to the wider discussion. I would suggest also talking a little bit about administrative detention, which is not a small part of the court. And I would love to give like the poster boy for administrative detention. But that, Joe, if you can say if we've got time and when we should do that.
We do have time for that. We will get to that. Let's very quickly just, I think that you raised an interesting point that the courts existed before Oslo and that they were different things. So if Yonah, you would quickly just sort of walk us through the timeline of the judicial system, and Maurice chime in. Let's just spend a couple minutes on this and then move to the next, more substantive.
Sure, and I just want to quickly push the book again. If you want to hear some really great debates between Maurice Hirsch and Chief Justice Aaron Mishnayot, some people might be interested also in reading the Palestinian characters, but some really fascinating debates among top Israelis between Maurice and the Chief Justice, who respect each other and get along very well on a personal level, but have some very interesting disagreements on some of the issues that we're talking about. Take a look at the book. You really, I think it's some great human reading, not just, we're talking about a lot of intellectual issues, but there's a lot of human side to it. We're really going to do the history extremely briefly because we're almost sort of to the Q&A part of this. So just very, very briefly, basically the courts commence operation June, or the system of justice is instituted June 6, 1967. Anybody knows their history, it's basically only a few days after the Six-Day War starts. There was a very, seeing into the future man who was running the IDF legal division named Meir Shamgar, who had already written basically laws and rules to take care of the situation if Israel was in the situation of having to administer the area. Now we're skipping a lot of stuff, and if you look in the book, you'll get significantly more detail sort of decade by decade. But one of the reasons that we highlight 1989 is because it was the beginning of the Military Appeals Court. And this was a forum for a lot of the reforms and changes that happened weren't always when a sort of law was passed by the legislator, actually, of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, is the general of the home front of the central command. But sometimes the judges on their own said, we know about new modern legal trends that are happening in evidence in Israel on a particular kind of crime in Israel. And we're going to bring that into Judea and Samaria, into the West Bank, without anyone asking us to do it, without a petition from a particular organization that might be critical of Israel. Sometimes the judges just said, this is, we know about modern trends, and we're going to keep the law as modern as possible for the Palestinians. And a lot of that, could happen before 1989, but it really took off in a lot of ways after 1989 because there was an appeals court to handle things. For those who don't know, that's not the end today. Now the court can also appeal all the way to the High Court of a Palestinian can appeal all the way to the High Court of Justice, which is not required under international law. So you could call it almost an extra. If you read the Palestinian side lawyers in my book, they'll say, well, the High Court doesn't intervene enough. You can read the book and make your own decision. But it is a unique thing that they, even though they're not citizens of Israel, they can appeal to our High Court, and it's not required under international law. I also flagged 2009 because that's the creation of the Juvenile Military Court. So there had been a process within Israel itself of increasing minors' rights, whether it be in terms of informing parents what was going on with them, whether it be in terms of having trained special judges to handle their cases, trained special police for interrogating them, having special rights as part of the interrogation. And basically in 2009, Judge Mishnayot, who's one of the other main characters in the book, starts bringing that in to the military courts. And eventually it also gets legislated, and there's additional reforms for making the rights of Palestinian minors better protected also in 2011, 2014, 2016, but it starts in 2009. And then there was another...
Actually, Yonah, if I could just interrupt for a second. It starts with myself in 2005. The case of a 13-year-old who's dressed in a suicide belt and sent by his terrorists to go and blow up Jews. And then dealing also as a prosecutor, seeing this kid who can barely see over the dock come into court, and you're now prosecuting him for trying to murder people. And how do you deal with that? That's when I initiated the idea of the juvenile courts, both within the prosecution and back to my previous unit, the legal advice for Judea and Samaria. That's really the start of the juvenile courts.
Okay, so we can give additional credit to Maurice in terms of when the courts actually started to systematically have the judges get this training and systematically have the police have to follow these requirements. That was 2009, but I'm always happy to give additional credit to Maurice, who again was in the courts at so many stages that he had a lot of impacts that he might not always been given official credit for. The last reform we're talking about is 2015, and this was some substantive criminal law issues. One example was there were some liberal trends in criminal law across the world and in Israel having to do with, let's say, somebody starts to maybe move towards committing a crime but withdraws in the middle. And so there are sort of more liberal trends about how to treat somebody like that in terms of conviction or sentencing. So they started to, that's just one example. There were a lot of other examples, and some of them can cut in different directions. But that was another reform. It's a sort of like another benchmark where Israel is trying to bring sort of more liberal laws, more protections to the Palestinian side. Again, when you read the book, you'll see that from the critics of Israel will say, oh, a lot of these things happened when we filed petitions to the High Court of Justice, and they were, putting pressure on it. But there's always another side, whether it's Maurice, who said he was doing things that not everybody has written about from 2005, or Aaron Mishnayot certainly says that he was starting to make moves about increasing Palestinian minors' rights before any petitions were filed by the High Court. So again, the reader can decide that himself. And
here, Yonah, I'll give you the other side of the coin. I was one of the biggest opponents to the reforms in 2015. Those are the discussions about the reforms actually started way before in 2005. and I prevented them going through until I left the prosecution. They were then passed in my absence. Just to explain, the reform in 2015 adopted large sections of the Israeli criminal law. Now, there's a word for that. It's called annexation. It's called applying Israel's civilian law to Judea and Samaria. Now, that's not something which Israel says it does. That's not something which the Palestinians say they would like Israel to do. In fact, when Israel discussed that idea at the beginning of this year with the Trump plan, like it or not, there was tremendous outcry. That is annexation. That's unacceptable. So why should these parts of Israeli law be automatically adopted or adopted into the law in Judea and Samaria? Let's remember, international law says that the law that was in force should stay in force. It should be changed if it's a specific necessity, absolute necessity. There was no absolute necessity. The system had worked for 50 years and it could continue working for another 50 years. Liberalism doesn't necessarily speak with that idea of, well, this is military courts and you have to be like Israel. Well, again, like I said, there's a word for that. It's applying Israel's civilian law to Judea and Samaria. And those same people who would petition the courts to equate the laws, to equalize the laws, to make the laws identical, are the same people who would then object to the application of Israeli law in Judea and Samaria, which in itself is something which is not a small source of discussion. But nonetheless, those reforms went through. I think it was a tremendous mistake. I think it's something which Israel should not have done. But I don't get to decide.
A quick 30-second comment, and just something from speaking to a lot of Israeli officials, some are in the book, some not in the book. One of the things I think Maurice is sort of alluding to, that Israeli officials are hesitant sometimes about making a large reform, is sometimes they'll make a large reform and then people will say, you're just doing that as a fig leaf. You're not doing it for real. And they put all kinds of work and energy into doing reforms, and they say, and we get the same criticism for it. So this is it's a real struggle, and I have a lot of respect for the officials who struggle with, how do they strike the right balance, and sometimes they might make a reform that could make life more difficult and require a lot of energy and still take criticism just because they think it's the right thing to do.
Let's get into administrative detention. I know Maurice raised this earlier and wanted to kind of touch on the issue a little bit more. So Maurice, I want to give you the floor on that topic.
Excellent, thank you, Joe. Let me explain to you, for those that don't know, let me explain to you what administrative detention is. Via really the poster boy for administrative detention, this is one of the distinct problems with webinars, with Zoom, as opposed to being in a hall and giving a discussion and seeing the audience. Here I need a little bit of audience participation, so I'll try and do it without that. I'm going to give you the poster boy for administrative detention. Samer El-Barak. So Samer El-Barak, remember that name? First name, Samer El-Barak. Samer El-Barak is the poster boy. Why do I say that? Samer El-Barak is a Palestinian smart kid. He grows up just outside Ramallah. He goes to university and studies microbiology. In 1989, he leaves Judea and Samaria and goes to do his doctorate in microbiology in Pakistan. In Pakistan, he meets a very nice gentleman called Ayman al-Zuhairi. Ayman al-Zuhairi sees that he has a devout Muslim who believes in the same type of Islam as Ayman believes in, and someone who has critical knowledge that could help Ayman and his good friend on their journey that really they're starting now, but Samer El-Barak could be a tremendous force within that process. So Ayman al-Zuhairi and Samer become friends. Samer finishes his degree, and Ayman takes Samer to meet his good friend. Now, I would ask the audience here, well, who is the friend of Ayman al-Zuhairi? And everyone would shake their heads and say, well, we know exactly who it is. It's Osama bin Laden. Yes, Osama bin Laden, that same guy, the guy who blows up the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers, it's him. Ayman al-Zawahiri is Osama bin Laden's deputy. He recruits Samuel al-Barak to set up, create, and activate for Al-Qaeda the first biological warfare laboratory. And that's what Samuel does. Samuel will eventually find himself arrested by the Americans and taken to Guantanamo. When the Americans have had enough of him, he will find his way through what we understand to be rendition to Jordan. Once the Jordanians have had enough with him, causing trouble in the prisons, the Jordanians will have a great idea. Since Samir is a Palestinian, if we bring him to the Allenby crossing, the crossing from Jordan into Jerusalem area, the Israeli authorities are required to allow him in. And that is what they do. They bring Samir al-Barak to Allenby crossing, and Israel has to let him in. Now, what do you do with a crazy Salafist who just wants to kill everybody, has the technical knowledge, the educational knowledge, and the experience to create dirty bombs for crazed Salafists? Now, this is the point in the question where I asked, well, now put your hand up if you want to live next door Samir al-Barak. And the answer is nobody. So what do you do with Samir al-Barak? He hasn't been in Judea and Samaria for 20 years. How do you now prosecute him for a crime? What crime do you prosecute him for? On the other hand, do you just let him go free? Absolutely not. Samir al-Barak needs to be in administrative detention. Administrative detention, you take a terrorist, you put him in detention until there is no longer a danger posed by him. The level that you have to show, the level of danger that you have to show is quite high obviously also in the regular cases. There are many other regular cases, and I'll give you other examples, right? Ayman Daragma. Ayman Daragma is arrested based on intelligence information that Ayman is about to go and blow himself up as a suicide bomber. He's arrested. There's no suicide belt. There's no weapons. All we have is a will that Ayman Daragma has written, giving away his worldly possessions. What are you prosecuting him for? For writing a will? How do we know what Ayman was going to do? Because we have an informant, possibly in the cell. Because we have surveillance of his telephone. Because we have some other way that we've understood what he's about to do. Is there a question that Ayman is about to carry out a suicide bombing? Absolutely not. There is evidence from both sides, including his will, obviously. Ayman goes to administrative detention. He sits there for 4.5 years. When he's let out, 3 months later, Ayman is dead. How did he die? His suicide belt blew up on the way to carrying out another suicide attack. That's what Ayman wants to do. Now, you have to understand administrative detention is not an Israeli invention. It was inherited from the Brits, from the Mandate period. It is specifically defined in the 4th Geneva Convention. Open Article 78 of the 4th Geneva Convention, and you will find administrative detention alongside assigned residence. It's acceptable under international law. It's the way that Israel implements the law is far higher than the standard or the minimum standard set by international law. And that's how you keep people safe. I have an entire lecture, which I give, which describes how, based on the number of administrative detainees going up and then going down, you can link it directly to the number of terror attacks that have been carried out. Who goes into administrative detention? Heads of terrorist organizations, leaders of terrorist organizations, and their foot soldiers that you can't put on trial. When the time comes and they're released, as the numbers go down, more terrorists are released, the number of terrorist attacks goes up. Now, you can read about administrative detention and the other side of administrative detention, not only in Yonah's book, but also the book called The Green Prince. The son of Hamas, the Shabak managed to recruit the son of one of the founders of Hamas. He provided us with a tremendous amount of security information and saved literally thousands of lives. The information that he gave was about specific terrorists. Now, what do? You have a source in a massive terrorist infrastructure that's connected to everything. But if you prosecute that one terrorist, you expose your source and you destroy your ability to save thousands of other lives. That's what administrative detention is. It's a balance between saving lives and personal freedom of terrorists. In that balance, whilst everybody's a proponent of the right to freedom and the right to avoid arrest, it's not an absolute right. In order to save hundreds of lives, you can use administrative detention and you can keep terrorists in jail. That is administrative detention. The process that Israel have of mandatory judicial review, not a requirement of international law. A right to appeal, not a requirement of international law. A right to appeal for a second time to the High Court of Justice, not a requirement of international law. Limiting each order to a maximum period of 6 months, not a requirement of international law, but that's what Israel does. These are all additional safeguards that are put there in order to guarantee that terrorists who have already committed offenses and are planning, even if it's only conspiracy, and are planning to commit additional terrorist attacks, go to jail to save lives. That's administrative detention.
So I want to add 1 or 2 points and also try to answer a couple of questions that I saw in the chat. So first of all, we're not going to be able to go into detail. If you want to go into detail, there's a whole chapter in the book about possible reforms to administrative detention that are supported by top, not all, and they haven't happened because not all, but top Israeli officials in the system, including the current Chief Justice. And the question there is not necessarily, do we have administrative detention or do we not have it? I think the Israeli officials in the system think it is necessary, just as Maurice has explained. The question is, the procedures that are part of the administrative detention, can aspects of them be made more friendly, more similar in some ways to standard criminal procedures without endangering security? And that's a debate. It's an interesting debate, and you can read about it in the book. I just saw some good questions on the chat. Somebody asked, is the standard for conviction in the Israeli military courts to deal with Palestinians the same as in most criminal courts beyond reasonable doubt? Yes, it is. Again, administrative detention, we're spending a lot of time talking about it because it's sort of like this sexy issue that gets into the global media, but it's a fraction of the people who come through the courts. The vast, vast majority of the people in the courts are in the regular criminal system. Beyond a reasonable doubt, administrative detention is a little bit different, but the vast majority, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. Somebody asked about, is there a death penalty? Technically speaking, there's a death penalty on the books, but it's not used. There was actually one instance a couple of decades ago where it was almost used, and even then it wasn't used. So there are some Israeli politicians who are pushing for it to be used today, but it still hasn't been used to date.
And ex-prosecutors.
And I just wanted to, in terms of administrative detention, Maurice mentioned the 6 months. There are people who criticize Israel and they say, oh, administrative detention, people are in administrative detention forever, as if like Guantanamo Bay, Cuba in the United States, there are some people that are still in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba in detention from the United States since 2001. That's not the way it works. Maurice gave an example of somebody who was in administrative detention for a very long time, but typically it's 6 months to a year, 2 years, and then people go free or they need to be criminally indicted. So when we say administrative, if you hear somebody say Israel does administrative detention, they throw people in a hole for the entire rest of their lives, it's just not true. That's not the way it works. It's a temporary measure. And if Israel wants to keep them for indefinitely, at some point there has to be a criminal indictment, and then there will be, beyond a reasonable doubt, the standard rules of evidence, etc. So it's really this period of 6 months or 2 years. How can we possibly deal with some of the rights that are being dealt with differently. How can we make it more similar to a standard criminal process? Is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea?
I would just like to, if I may, Joe, just to respond to one of the other questions that I saw, because I touched on it just briefly and then I moved on.
Yeah, just real quick. We've been authorized to go over, given the engagement we've seen from the audience. If it's okay with you guys, let's just keep going.
Yeah, I'm fine. I'd just like to explain one thing. I said about my child, if he was arrested, God forbid, and is under interrogation, that I wouldn't be allowed into the interrogation room. You have to understand again the system here. You have the right, a fundamental right, to consult with a lawyer before being interrogated. Obviously, through the process, you have a right to be represented by a lawyer. And if the police breach your right to consult with a lawyer, it is one of the only cases in Israeli criminal law where they've applied the rule of the fruit of the poisonous tree, which doesn't necessarily exist at all in Israeli criminal law, but rather in the civilian law, and therefore not also in the military law. But if already from 2001, the Supreme Court decided that breach of the right to consult with a lawyer was a fundamental breach of the rights of the suspect, and that would potentially lead to, in the circumstances, the quashing of any confession that he gave. That is something which is applied in the civilian courts. It's also applied in the military courts. So that's something which I saw came up and must be understood. That the due process, I mean, that's what you're looking for when you're judging a justice system to see whether it meets the standards. The due process requirements, I think, definitely meet every international standard, and also meet the standards of most countries. Again, right to confront your accusers, the right to receive what I give in the lectures that I give. I always refer, and it always gives away my age, and I apologize. I always refer to the film My Cousin Vinny. Well, Vinny, you know, everybody knows the film Vinny. He's trying to learn law. His cousins get prosecuted for a crime they didn't commit, and they go down to this southern state, and Vinny goes and befriends the prosecutor and asks him for all of the evidence, and he gives him the evidence, obviously, and Vinny goes back all happy from his hunting trip and explains this to his girlfriend, and he says, "But you're an idiot." That's the responsibility, the duty of the prosecution. He wasn't being nice. He has to give you all the evidence. That applies here as well. The prosecution is required to give over the evidence to the defense, and really everything that you can see along that process is something which has to be met and dealt with. Sorry, Joe, I just wanted to clarify that question.
Joe, I saw another good question that I can answer if that works.
Please. Yeah.
Okay.
Please.
Somebody asked a really good question. Do the Israeli military courts, if they find, and prosecutors, if they find somebody is wrongly detained or even wrongly convicted or even maybe wrongly sentenced and put in jail, do they deal with this? And the answer is yes. There's actually some cases described in the book of mistaken identity, or an instance where some of the security information that was obtained in the end was brought into question because it was sort of older security information. And so some of these cases come in the book, and the Israeli prosecution or judges who are involved will free people, will cancel indictments, will free people if they find out that the information is different. So the people here are concerned about the truth. It's not, there's sort of this accusation as if everybody in Israel is like sort of this factory of, almost, mindless, just anti-Palestinian. That's not the way it works. People, I can tell you from having served, there are big debates, fiery, people know fiery Israeli debates. There are big fiery debates about whether to indict somebody or not. And sometimes, even when somebody's indicted, sometimes even when somebody's been convicted, people will be released, indictments will be annulled. And I think that's, critics might say, oh, look, Israel, rushed in and got it wrong. And I would say, Israel is so serious about the truth, that when new evidence comes to light, nobody's trying to sort of cover it up. They're going to let somebody go if they're innocent. I actually myself have to go in a couple of minutes. I was shortly before this conference, I was covering IDF Chief of Staff Aviv Kochavi, who was giving a speech about Iran and Lebanon and Gaza. So Joe, I don't know if there's any last question or two you want to ask, or any last question, issue you wanted me to address. I probably have to drop off in about 3 to 5 minutes to meet my deadline.
I'm happy to stay and answer any questions, Joe, if that's a problem.
I want to unpack a little bit more about how the rules of evidence in the criminal procedure are identical for, we mentioned, for Israelis and in the military court system as applied to the Palestinians. Are they applied similarly is, I think, an important question to also be asking. And Maurice, why don't you weigh in on that to the extent you can?
Wait, can I just go first because I'm going to exit in a minute?
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
And then Maurice, you can be nice to me after I leave.
Okay, I'll try. Depends on what you say now.
Yeah. So basically, the general rule is that they're identical. There are exceptions in security cases. And then we sort of get into sort of debates about what is a security case. Is a security case just a terrorist who killed somebody? A security case is a rock thrower. What's a rock thrower? There are rock throwers who kill people. This isn't something that's often admitted by critics of Israel. They say, oh, a rock thrower is, there's a famous picture of a small Palestinian boy standing in front of a tank from the First Intifada throwing a rock. He didn't get arrested. He wasn't sent to jail. So there's a lot of rock throwers who are not arrested, who are not sent to jail. And there's rock throwers who are dangerous. There's been a number of people killed. I discussed the Asher Palmer case in my book. And there have been other people, unfortunately, since then who've been killed by rocks. And then there's other rocks that can be dangerous. So in those cases, sometimes, although the amount of time in detention now is closer to what it might be in Israel, sometimes the detention periods might not be entirely identical to what they are in Israel. And because of the nature, and Maurice can probably elaborate with a little bit more time, can elaborate about this a little bit more, the nature of the inability to just arrest people who are Palestinian. If an Israeli commits a crime and he lives in Tel Aviv or Haifa, you know where he works, you know where he lives, you can arrest him. Okay, and Palestinian who lives in Judea and Samaria in a West Bank Palestinian village, you can't just go in there. There have been instances where people went in during the day to do an arrest, and there was a village-wide battle because of this one person. So they started to do more arrests at night, which is a whole nother controversy, to try to avoid the whole village getting into a fight. So in those cases, there are some differences. People do tend in the Palestinian side to be in detention for longer periods, simply because there's no way to guarantee that otherwise they'll actually be brought to justice. But it depends. There are lower level crimes where people are not held in detention. In those cases, it's going to be completely identical. And where there are differences, like I said, in security cases, there's some good reasons for those differences. And again, there's also described in the book, there's some attempts sometimes to do some reforms related to those issues to make them as close as possible to the way Israel does things. I just want to again thank Joe, Richard, Yifa for helping make the book possible in a variety of ways. Maurice for being one of my 4 main characters and being an amazing Israeli advocate. If you just want to hear somebody who can just shoot down the arguments of unfair criticism against Israel, Maurice is really unmatched. And so definitely you can read more about him in the book. And I apologize, I can't stay on longer. This has been a fantastic conversation. And if people have more questions, you can be in touch with Joe. He can forward on questions to me afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yonah. And we have been sharing a link to purchase Yonah's book below in the chat for any who are interested. I highly recommend it. It reads like, to me, my opinion is it reads like the movie Traffic, where it has all of these compelling stories that you really see a lot of different perspectives of such an interesting conflict that so many people have so many opinions about, but not always as much knowledge. And it really does shed a lot of light. So thank you, Yonah, for appearing today. And good luck. We will continue, as Maurice has offered, to answer some questions. Have a nice day, Yonah.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care. Maurice, somebody has asked about the death sentence, which Yonah said is on the books, but what would it take, and you've expressed interest, what would it take for the death sentence to actually be put into use?
Really, that links me to Yonah's last comment, which I actually wanted to clarify, because it wasn't on point to the question that you asked, and I think needed clarification. The death penalty. The death penalty technically exists in Judea and Samaria. It exists in international law for areas such as Judea and Samaria. If you look again at Article 68 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, you will see that the death penalty for certain crimes is certainly something which can be given down. That's the theory. It's written in the law. It appears in the law. The practice is very different. The practice is that Israel has only sentenced two people to death as a final sentence. One was Adolf Eichmann. From Adolf Eichmann, we learned so many things. For example, what do you do with a defendant who has been kidnapped from a foreign country and brought to justice in Israel? Does that fit in with the laws of fruit of the poisonous tree? Don't know. Israeli law? He's here now. We don't care how he arrived here. Not interested. That's something which was set by Eichmann. Should that necessarily be the standard across the board? Don't know. We'll leave that as a question. The other guy, the other person sentenced to death and his sentence was carried out was a guy called Tubiansky, a soldier who was accused of treason already during the Independence War. He was summarily tried by a field court martial, convicted and sentenced to death. It then turned out that he was obviously innocent. That, much more than anything else, has given Israel literally national trauma about the idea of the death sentence. That's on the one hand. So Israel does not believe in having the death sentence as a punishment which is actually implemented. It appears in the law books, both for the Israeli civilian system in certain circumstances and in the military courts. When would it be implemented? So I was involved in two cases where there was discussion and serious discussion about the death sentence. The first case was a terrorist by the name of Raid Sheikh. No one's going to know where that is. It doesn't matter. But let me describe to you an event. The penny will drop immediately. You'll understand what I'm talking to you about. It's October 2000. Two Israeli reservist soldiers are driving from central Israel, Modi'in area, towards their base in Bet El. They don't have Waze. It didn't exist at the time, which is a common satellite navigation system. It didn't exist. They have a map. Their map says to them that when you get to the Givat Ze'ev junction, you turn left, and then straight north, you're going to get to Bet El. Fabulous. Why not? They get in their car and they drive off and they get to the Givat Ze'ev junction and they turn left and they come to the Bitunia crosspoint. At the Bitunia crosspoint, they are literally arrested by Palestinian policemen. They are taken to the police station in Ramallah. In the police station in Ramallah, they are lynched. They are beaten to death by a frenzied mob. The policeman, the Palestinian policeman, a policeman who leads the assault on the two soldiers, beating them with a car wrench, is Raid Sheikh. Two of the three judges dealing with his case, having convicted him, then decided to give him the death sentence. But the death sentence requires a unanimous decision of a panel of judges, all of the rank of lieutenant colonel, And since there was one dissenting judge, the death sentence didn't go through. In 2014, I am now the head of the prosecution. There's an event which is off the charts. 3 Israeli teenagers are kidnapped by members of Hamas, executed. Their bodies are hidden for a month. The search for the children who we think are still alive continues on. Hamas in Gaza sees that as an assault on the Palestinian people and starts a war, firing hundreds of missiles at Israel. These 3 people started a war. Not only did they murder 3 little kids, they started a war. So already before the arrest of the 2 main perpetrators, I prepared a recommendation that should they be arrested alive, we should then ask for the death sentence. Now, that's not an easy request. There are many, many procedural requirements on the way. For example, whilst many of the trials in the military courts end with a confession, with some type of plea bargain or just a confession. For example, take Abdallah Barghouti. Abdallah Barghouti, for those who aren't familiar with the name, murderer of 67 people, 5 different suicide attacks, including the Hebrew University attack, which killed a number of American citizens, the Sbarro pizza attack, 7 members of one family wiped out. Abdallah Barghouti comes into the court on the day of his indictment and says, I confess, write whatever you want. If I had the chance, I would have killed more Jews. And you know what? I want the death sentence. That wasn't something which was then considered to be an option, and he wasn't prosecuted and he wasn't given the death sentence. The procedural requirements are a full trial. What Joe asked and what I asked to clarify before Yonah left was, what about the application of the rules of evidence, the laws of evidence? Not just the theory that it's the same, it's exactly the same laws. What Yonah described as the differences for security cases is something which exists in Israeli law. Israeli civilian law provides for the prosecution of terrorists. Not all terrorists are prosecuted in the military courts. Many are prosecuted in the civilian courts. People like Abbas Said, the terrorist who was responsible for sending the suicide bomber to blow up the Park Hotel on the night of the Seder of the Passover Fest in 2002. Marwan Barghouti, the Fatah leader, and dozens of others. The Israeli civilian rules of evidence cater also for terrorist crimes. And those same rules of evidence are not just a theory in the military courts, they are applied 100%. That is something which has to be understood. So to get to a death sentence, you have to hold a full trial. That means any time there's a problem with the rules of evidence, the trial falls. The prosecution could potentially fall. The conviction, which may have seemed certain before, is now suddenly uncertain. Once the prosecution has presented its case, obviously there's the case for the defense. Prosecution has to bring all of the witnesses. They have to be cross-examined. A decision then has to be made unanimously by a 3-judge panel. Again, explaining the difference between Israeli law and American law. There are no juries here. In Israel, there is a professional judge system. There are no juries. Everything is decided by the judge or by the panel of judges. They hear the evidence. They are less open and less free for the manipulation of a good lawyer asking possibly a prosecutor, making the mistake of, oh, well, Mr. OJ, why don't you put this glove on? That doesn't work here. It's professional judges. And therefore, that ability to bring theatrical into the court and to influence the jury is much more limited. Once the decision is made, an automatic requirement that decision be appealed, and then there's the ability to ask for clemency. It's a very long process, which again, the process is long and complicated, but no one really thinks of truly implementing it. It requires a specific case of specific severity. And then, like I said, I made that recommendation or prepared that recommendation in 2004. In the end, the two main perpetrators resisted their arrest, a gun battle ensued, and they were killed at the spot. So the recommendation became moot. But that is, in a nutshell, the death sentence.
All right, thank you, Maurice. I'm going to give you an opportunity to provide some closing remarks, then we'll turn over to Yifa to conclude the program. But before I do, for those attorneys who would like to receive a certificate of attendance for your participation today, so that you may file it with your individual bar associations, please email our legal assistant, Kiana Fogel, at kcfogel@hnklaw.com, who will be pleased to transmit the certificate to you. Your email should reflect the two codes which we have given you during the program. The first code was law, and the second code, which we will say now, is justice. This information is also included right now at the chat at the bottom of the screen. So if you missed anything I said, it is there and you can locate it. So with that, Maurice, please provide your closing remarks, and then Yifa, we'll turn it over to Yifa to wrap up the program. Thank you.
So what I hope I've managed to impress upon those listening is that whilst the military court system seems to have a bad name, and there's due predominantly to tremendous misinformation, to understand the system, it's important to know how it works, what it entails, which cases it deals with, and what are the fundamentals of due process that are applied in the court. I challenge anybody to honestly find flaws in the system which would fail the general requirements of due process. Again, not a comparison to any other specific legal system other than the Israeli system, and then understand that the criticism of the system is really a criticism of Israeli criminal law. Yonah said before that I'm possibly a vocal actor in this whole forum for shooting down the arguments of others. That's critical to understand. When you have criticism of Israel, say that you are criticizing Israel. When you have criticism of the military system, because it's the military, it's the IDF against the poor Palestinians, and therefore it must be inherently biased, then understand that what you're arguing is not true. You're arguing against the Israeli criminal system. And that is a fundamental argument which must be understood. And when you frame it in the ideas of, well, this is only against the military because the prosecution of Palestinians is so biased and so unfair, know what you're arguing. You're not attacking the military system. You're not attacking Maurice, the chief prosecutor. You're attacking Israeli criminal law, which is a system which generally is respected internationally. And therefore, when he says that I'm good at knocking down the arguments, I'm good at understanding what the underlying arguments being made are and how flawed they are and pointing that out. If you tell me that it's terrible that children can't be accompanied by their parents into the interrogation room, I might agree. If you tell me that it's a disgusting system of the Israeli military occupation against the Palestinians and it's prejudicial to their rights, I'll say clearly, you're a liar. Because that is the system in Israel. If you have a problem with the system in Israel, that's fine. But say it. Making or cherry coating the arguments, trying to focus only on the military system, is something which will almost never succeed. Because there's almost nothing unique about the military system that can really justify those claims and say that they're specific to the military court and not to the general Israeli criminal system. that's just the I think the fundamental idea that I was trying to give over, and really you can see it written more and more in the stuff that I put out.
Thank you, Maurice. Yifa, why don't you close us out here? Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody. This was, well, to me, even though I've learned a lot about this in the past as well, and I've heard Maurice speak, and I've visited the military courts oftentimes, and I've helped Yonah a little bit with his book. This was still eye-opening, and I think it's an incredibly important topic. Maurice, I want to add something, because I think maybe this is, on a rare occasion, I'll say that you're nicer than me on this specific issue of comparing military systems, and I'll tell you why. And I'll tell you why, because I know a lot about different judicial systems around the world, and there's always room, there are always differences. So you can zoom in on one particular issue, like you've said, that parents can be in the room doing interrogations, but then if you look at a million other factors, then you'll see differences, and one time the system is better in this sense, and then the other system is maybe, in your opinion, better in other respects. So I definitely think, after getting to know so many judicial systems, democratic judicial systems around the world, obviously, because we don't compare to other systems, I do believe that the Israeli system, generally speaking, is a very, very good one, even perhaps superior to many other democratic judicial systems, even if specific issues can be criticized and should be criticized, because we, as Israeli citizens and as lawyers and human rights activists, often criticize our own systems to try to improve them, because there's always room for improvement also in this area. And so I want to thank everyone. Joe, Tipograph, you did an amazing job moderating and preparing this, and thank you so much for that. Maurice, of course, amazing as always. Yonah is not here, but I want to thank him also again. By the way, if you have any questions or anything, you're always welcome to email every single one of us. If you have questions for Maurice, I'll forward that to him, or to Yonah, or to anyone else. And thank you also again to Heideman, Nudelman, and Kalik for their support, for their help, for their sponsorship, and of course the Israel Forever Foundation. Did I forget anyone, Joe?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Have a great evening, everyone.
Just maybe as a last comment, for Yifa has my email. I'm happy for you to give it out to anybody and everybody. If you want to ask questions, it can be direct as well. I've nothing to hide, and I spend my life writing answers. So it's you're more than welcome.
All right. Have a good evening.
Emails are down at the bottom of the screen. Thank you.